Good day once again, everyone. And this day, we're going to continue to our discussion in line with the lesson that we've been talking in the previous discussion. It's all about the globalization of world economics. And part of that topic that we've been talking is all about on how the globalization really affects our economics right now. So part of these topics are the following: international trading systems, the Bretton Woods system, neoliberalism and its discontents, the global financial crisis and the challenge to neoliberalism. And also we're going to talk about the economic globalization today and international economic integration. Now let's start with economic or international economic integrations or integration. It is a central tenet of globalization. In fact, it is so crucial to the process that many writers and commentators confuse this integration for the entirety of globalization. As a reminder, economics is just one window into the phenomenon of globalization. It is not the entire thing. Nevertheless, much globalization is anchored on changes in the economy. Global culture, for example, is facilitated by trade. Filipinos would not be aware of American culture if not for the trade that allows locals to watch American movies, listen to American music, and consume American products. Dami din sa atin dito na gumagamit tayo ng mga ukay-ukay. That is one thing that we must learn na hindi yun galing sa Filipino. Mahirapan tayo mag-patronize. Alam mo naman mga Filipino, just like what I've been wearing right now, if you can read that particular special characters here, so definitely this is not from the Philippines. This is from either Japanese or Chinese special characters that we've seen on the screen right now. Okay? Now, the globalization of politics is likewise largely contingent on trade relations. These days, main events of foreign affairs are conducted to cement trading relations among states. Kasi hindi lahat, bawat bansa ay makanya-kanyang presidente, bawat bansa ay may kanya-kanyang tagagawa ng batas. Kagaya sa atin, meron tayong presidente, vice president, meron tayong senado. Meron din tayong office of the congressional or elected congressmen. So, silang mga sangay ng mga ahensya, sila yung gumagawa ng batas upang may sakatuparan kung ano yung dapat na isakatuparan. Sila yung tumutulong upang mapalago ang ekonomiya. Pero maging walang saysay ang lahat kung magkakaroon tayo ng faction with the executive body. Kung hindi magkasundo ang executive, legislative, and judiciary body, mahirapan din tayo. Dapat ang tatlong ahensya na yan ay magkasundo para sa kalalago ng ating bansa. Given the stakes involved in economic globalization, it is perennially important to ask how this system can be made more just. Although some elements of global free trade can be called back or can be rather scaled back, policies cannot do away with it is a whole or kabuuan. International policy makers should strive to think of ways to make trading deals fairer. Kailangan pantay. Hindi, porket mayaman sila nakakauna o porket mahirap hindi mo makukuha. It should be pantay tayong lahat. Para wala naman tayong maatakan na hindi maka-afford. Dapat tayong lahat din. Okay? Now, governments must also continue to devise ways of cushioning the most damaging effects of economic globalization while ensuring that its benefits accrue for everyone. Kailangan siguraduhin ng ating gobyerno, ng ating pamahalaan, na maging safety tayo lahat in terms of economic, dapat tayong lahat ay nakakinabang at nagtutulong-tulungan. Kaso nangyayari, daming kumakalaban sa gobyerno, oy, paano natin mapahiaon yung ating ekonomiya? Bakit pag tumataas yung petrolyo, bakit gobyerno kaagad ang pagbibintangan? Bakit? Gobyerno bang gumagawa ng petrolyo? Magnilay-nilay naman tayo bago tayo gagawa ng hakbang. Tayo ngayon, pag hindi lang natugunan yung mga katanungan natin, kaagad nating i-personal ang isang tao. Minsan, bias din tayo magtrato ng isang tao. Ayon lang sa ating kagustuhan. Okay, now let's continue. The localizing the material, yung sariling atin. Now, going back to that particular localizing the material, hindi tayo marunong mag-patronize ng sariling produkto natin. Pilipino tayo, pero mahilig tayo sa ukay-ukay. Pilipino tayo, pero dami tayong reklamo sa mga Philippine product. We are not contented. Kasi nga, karamihan sa mga Pilipino, mga perfectionists, karamihan sa mga Pilipino, ay waring mga magagaling. Sila naman yung may very questionable yung mga pag-uugali. Anong naitulong at naiambag natin sa Pilipinas upang mahihaw natin ito? Okay, so let's try to continue now and let's try to drive it through so that we'll be able to understand fully kung ano ba talaga ang mga bagay-bagay na pwede natin gawin upang sabihin magkakaroon at maglago ang ating ekonomiya ng ating bansa. Huwag natin sabihin, hindi ko to kaya. Kaya mo yan. Ang importante lang ay bigyan natin ng pansin ang dapat na pagbigyan at una natin ang dapat pagtunan upang sagay makamtan din natin ang ninanais natin. Mahirap mag-patronize ng mga produktong gawa natin. Mahirap din mag-patronize ng mga produktong sariling atin kasi mahilig tayo mag-imitate ng mga bagay-bagay na hindi naman nakakatulong sa ekonomiya ng ating bansa. Ngayon, panay ka reklamo. Reklamo ka ng reklamo, pero wala ka namang naiambag. Mahilig ka magbili ng mga mamahaling gamit, but not Philippine product. Try to think it over. Magreklamo ka, mahal ang mga tuition fees ng mga paaralan. Lahat, mahal. Lahat, puro na lang reklamo. You never tried to appreciate the single beauty of the payment that you've done. Kasi hindi natin binibigay yung best natin. Panay lang tayo nakakita ng mali. Pero ikaw, ako, tayo, hindi natin nakikita sa ating sarili ang mga kulangan na dapat nating tugunan din. Feeling magaling kasi tayo. Feeling magaling ikaw, ako, sila, o tayong lahat. Magpakatotoo ka para magkakaroon ka ng totoong kaligayahan sa iyong puso. Many Philippine industries were devastated by unfair trade deals under the GATT and eventually the WTO. One sector that was particularly affected was Philippine agriculture. Okay, daming mga kapitalista binibili ang palay sa mumurahing presyo pero binibenta sa merkado ang super duper kamahal. Nakapagtataka, I can still remember when my late cousins still alive, sabi nila, pinaghirapan nila na itanim yung mga palay, inaasikaso ng maigi. Here comes yung aanihin na. Ang mumurang ng presyo na binibili ng mga kapitalista. Pero nagtaka sila, pagdating na sa merkado, ang mamahal. Sometimes, times 2, times 3, or times 4 ang presyo sa presyong pagbili nila ng palay na naging bigas. Pero nabigyan ba ng pansin ng gobyerno? Oo naman. Hindi lang lantaran ng mga gobyerno, ito binibigyan ko, siguro meron ng iba, karamihan, daming nagwiwilga against the government because our own product was not really given more importance. Pero ang tanong ngayon, mga farmers nga ba talaga ang nagwiwilga o ang mga kapitalista? O yung silang nagbabalat buto? O yung gusto lang magbalat ng buto sa mga effort ng totoong gumagawa ng balat ng buto. Okay, let's continue. According to Walden Bellio and a team of researchers at Focus of the Global South, the US used its power under the GATT system to prevent Philippine importers from purchasing Philippine poultry and pork, even as it sold meat to the Philippines. Gumagawa sila. Nag-aangkat tayo ng mga poultry sa ibang bansa, ng mga karning baboy, karning baka. Of course, hindi gaano kamahalan ang dinadagdag. Imposible naman yung nagnegosyo ka, bilhin mo to ng ng 2 piso, ibebenta mo din ng 2 piso, may binabayar mo pa yung taxes. Dami ka pang binabayaran nito. Yung nilalagyan nito, binabayaran mo, hindi libre. Malamang tutubuan mo rin kahit papaano, kahit konti. Yung hindi ka talaga maging lugi. Hindi ka nga magpalugi. Pag nagkamali nga lang yung isang teacher sa mga questioners, ang bunganga mo parang machine gun din. Kung makapaghusga, wagas din. Hindi ba pwedeng magkakamali? Hindi ba pwedeng malugi ka saglit? Hindi naman ikaw ang sumasagot, si Google naman din. Di ba? Mas lugi si Google kasi hindi mo binabayaran, hindi mo pinapasasalamatan. Okay? Now, although the Philippines expected to make up losses in sectors like meat with gains in areas such as coconut products, no significant change was realized. In 1993, coconut export amounted of $1.9 billion, and after a slight increase of $2.3 billion in 1997, it returned to 1.9 billion still in 2100. You see, in 2000s, parehas pa rin din yun. E paano yung mga coconut products natin ngayon? Hindi ka proud na anak ka ng tinatawag natin quote-unquote mananggete. Pero proud ka sa pagka-anak ng Marites at Tolets. O, di ba? Mahirap ng ganun. Okay. Now, most strikingly, Bellio and Company noted that the Philippines became a net food importer under the GATT. In 1993, the country had an agricultural trade surplus of $299 million. It had a deficit of $764 million in 1997 and $794 million in 2002. Now, how can we face now the economic globalization today? How can you able to determine the economic globalization today? If you're not going to help yourself, if you're not going to cooperate for the betterment of our globalization, for the betterment of our economy, how can you give me an assurance that you'll be the focal person to help and to aid this and that, and you'll be the focal person in order to augment the scarcity of our country? Hindi nga tayo marunong mag-patronize, parehasan din tayo that sa iba na that we are always barking in a wrong tree. Economic globalization today, the global financial crisis will take decades to resolve. Hindi yan magic. May proseso tayo. The solutions proposed by certain nationalists and leftist groups of closing national economies to world trade, however, will no longer work. The world has become too integrated. Whatever one's opinion about Washington consensus is, it is undeniable that some of international trade remains essential for countries to develop in the contemporary world. So ano yung naintindihan natin sa contemporary world? Ngayon, ang kaganapan ngayon, anong nangyayari noon? Kasi mahilig tayong bumalik sa kahapon. Naging karanasan mo na yun. Naway maging stepping stone mo siya, pupapalago mo pa ang kasalukuyan, huwag ka pabalik-balik para kang sirang plaka eh. Kaya hindi tayo umaasenso kasi mahilig tayong magpuna sa mali ng iba pero hindi natin napupuna yung sarili nating mali. mga matured na po tayo. Naway, maramdaman din natin ang totoong kahirapan ng ating ekonomiya sa kasalukuyan. Ang kabataan natin ang mapapahamak, hindi tayo. Mag-isip din tayo ng mga paraan upang makatulong din tayo sa gobyerno. Hindi lang umaasa sa gobyerno. Hindi umaasa ka sa gobyerno. Pero ang tanong, nagbabayad ka ba ng saktong taxes mo? Oo. Mahirap na. Kaya ikaw lang yung makasagot nun. Huwag kang mahiya. Kung nagbayad ka ng malaking taxes mo o tamang taxes mo, then you have the right to complain. Pero pag wala, ay nako, magbayad ka muna para mas lalo kang matauhan kung may naiambag ka ba talaga sa ating bansang Pilipinas. Bato-bato sa langit, ang nakikinig, pasensya, kasi dami naman talaga hindi nagbabayad eh. Walang nakakalam nun. Pasensya po, pero saludo pa rin ako sa iyo kasi panay ka reklamo. Okay? Export, not just the local selling of goods and services, make national economies grow at present. So panay ka nag-export. Tumatanggap ka ba ng imports? Hindi. Gusto mo product mo lang ipa-export. Ayaw mo din nang itanggap yun sa kanila, it should be barter. Kung nag-export ka sa kanila, tanggapin mo din yung gina-import nila sa'yo. Halitan kayo para makadevelop ka din ng harmonious relationship. Huwag mo namang taasan ng presyo para affordable din sa mga Pilipino. Eh, yun ng mga foreigner, binibili ang product ng mga Pilipino according to my cousins living in other country. I'm not going to mention the particular country. Sabi niya, may kasamahan silang mga ganito ang nationality. Binibili na sa lagang 10 piso. Nagtaka kami pagdating dito na ang produktong yun, nagtaka kami parang nasa Pilipinas lang din kami. Bakit? Kasi ang presyo 2 piso lang ang tubo. Minsan hindi pa umabot ng 2 piso. Nagtaka kami kung hindi ba siya lugi sa mga shipping fee. Pero sabi ng company, hindi siya malulugi kasi volumes ang binibili niya. Hindi pa konti-konti. Yun ang maganda. Nakakatulong na at natulungan ka pa. At lumalago pang ekonomiya. Dami pang nakikinabang sa magandang pamamaraan at pamamalakad ng isang kampanyang katulad ng sinasabi ng aking cousin. Okay, now let's continue. Now, the United States, Japan, and the member countries of the European Union were responsible for 65% of global exports, while the developing countries only accounted for 29%. See? When more countries opened up their economies to take advantage of increased free trade, the shares of the percentage began to change. By 2011, developing countries like the Philippines, India, China, Argentina, and Brazil accounted for 51% of global exports, while the share of advanced nations, including the United States, had gone down to 45%. The WTO-led reduction of trade barriers known as trade liberation. Pag sinasabi nating WTO-led reduction of trade barriers has something to do with trade liberalization, has profoundly altered the dynamics of the global economy. In the recent decades, partly as a result of this increased exports, economic globalization has ushered in an unprecedented spike in global growth rates. Hindi natin nakikita yan. Okay? Kung paano nagaganap, slowly but surely. According to the IMF, the global per capita GDP rose over 5-fold in the second half of the 20th century. It was this growth that created the large Asian economies like Japan, China, Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Bakit hindi nasama si Philippines? Sana isama na natin si Philippines balang araw, bukas sa makalawa. Tulong-tulong tayo para maangat din natin ang ating bansa. Instead na push up natin, going up, mahilig tayo pahila pababa. Crab mentality masyado. Kung sino na yung umaangat, hinihila pang pababa. I-push mo ng pataas. Malay mo, matutulungan ka rin sa kanyang kaginhawaan. Kung sino pa yung nagpiling magaling-galingan, sila pa yung very questionable ang mga attitude. Okay? Marami din sa atin dito, feeling magaling, feeling matalino, feeling mabuting tao. Asal, ewan ko, anong klaseng asal yun? Tandaan lang natin, balikan natin yung katanungan, nakakatulong ka ba sa ekonomiya ng ating bansa ngayon? Okay? Economic globalization remains an even process with some countries, corporations, and individuals benefiting a lot more than others. First, okay, let's try to have this. The series of trade talks under the WTO have the World Trade Organization led to unprecedented reduction in tariffs and other trade barriers. But these processes have often been unfair. Bakit kaya naging unfair to? Pakinggan natin na maigi. First, developed countries are often protectionist. Okay? Protectionist. So in short, may pinoprotektahan sila always, as they repeatedly refuse to leave policies that safeguard their primary products that could otherwise be overwhelmed by imports from the developing world. The best example of this double standard is Japan's determined refusal to allow rice imports into the country to protect its farming sector. Japan's justification is that rice is sacred. So, na-justify nila. Bakit ayaw nilang i-export yung rice nila? Sabi din ng mga pamangkin ko, bira ka lang makabili ng rice na naka-export. Kasi, grabe ang Japan in terms of attitude. Sa pagpapahalaga ng isang bagay, sa pagpahalaga ng kanilang ekonomiya, sa pagko-cooperate ng bawat mamamayan, ay makikita mo talaga sa hubad mong mga mata. Naging huwaran ang Japan sa kanilang pagkamagalang, pagkamarespeto. Hospitable nga tayo. Pero in attitude, I cannot say that we are still hospitable of our attitude. Towards our economy, I don't think so. Okay, sana naging hospitable tayo sa ibang bansa, naging hospitable tayo sa ibang tao, ganoon din sana sa ating ekonomiya. Okay? Now, ultimately, it is its economic muscle as the third largest economy that allows it to resist pressures to open its agricultural sector. Kaya siguro maluwag yung agrikultura natin, kaya tingnan natin yung mga farmers natin, kawawang-kawawa talaga sila. My heart really bleeds na kasi pinaghirapan yung pagtanim ng palay. Magtanim ay hindi biro. Ngunit sa oras ng anihan, sana kawawa yung ating mga farmers. Nagbuhos ng maraming pawis, maraming efforts, minsan may kapital pa na hiniram. Nung nakaani na sila, wala na. Pambayad lang ng hiniram na kapital at wala nang natira sa kanila. Sana magkakaroon din ng pagbabago in our own contemporary world in this new era. Isa ka na doon, makatulong ka na din. Naway mabuksan mo din ang iyong isipan. Now let's continue. Isipan natin, hindi lang ikaw, ako, tayong lahat. The United States likewise firstly protects its sugar industry, forcing consumers and sugar-dependent business to pay higher prices instead of getting cheaper sugar from plantations of Central America. Imagine, pati sugar nila, protektado din sa Amerika. Sa inyo, sa atin, ayan, kung makagamit ka ng sugar, wagas, kaya daming diabetic, walang self-control. Oo. Ingat-ingat din sa paggamit ng sugar, sa paggamit ng asin, kasi ang kidney ng katamaan, totoo nga ba talaga na may pinoprotektahan tayong mga produkto? Okay? Faced with this blatantly protectionist measures from powerful countries and blocks, poorer countries can do very little to make economic globalization more just. Trade imbalances characterize economic relations between developed and developing countries. The beneficiaries of global commerce, so to say, have been mainly transnational corporations or TNCs, and not governments. And like any other businesses, these TNCs are concerned more with profits than with assisting the social programs of the governments hosting them. Host countries in turn loosen tax laws, which prevents wages from rising. So, hindi gaanong higpitan ng mga tax para protektaran din ang pagtaas ng pasahuran. While sacrificing social and environmental programs that protect the underprivileged members of their societies. The term race to the bottom refers to countries. The term race to the bottom refers to countries lowering their labor standards, including the protection of workers' interests to lure in foreign investors seeking high profit margins at the lowest cost possible. Governments weaken environmental laws to attract investors, creating fatal consequences on their ecological balance and depleting them of their finite resources like oil, coal, and minerals. So in this particular discussion, I can give you an assurance that majority of these things is really happening to our society nowadays. It's really happening to our economic globalization or global problems now. So what can we do in order for us na makatulong, na makahanap ng solusyon para sa paglago ng ekonomiya ng ating bansa o ng ating mamayan o ng ating barangay o ng ating pamilya? Ano kayang pwede nating maitulong sa magitan ng ating sarili? Ikaw lang ang makasagot nun. Okay, let's continue the last topic on this particular lesson. The global financial crisis and the challenge to neoliberalism. Russia's scare was just one example of how the shock therapy of neoliberalism did not lead to the ideal outcomes predicted by economists who believed in perfectly free markets. The greatest recent repudiation of this thinking was the recent global financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. Neoliberalism came under significant strain during the global financial crisis of 2007-2008 when the world experienced the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression. The crisis can be traced back to the 1980s when the United States systematically removed various banking and investment restrictions. The scaling lack of regulation continued until the 2000s, paving the way for a brewing crisis. Taking advantage of cheap housing loans, Americans began building houses that were beyond their financial capacities. Kita nyo kung gaano na kahirap noon, nagkakaroon na tayo ng global financial crisis, pero patuloy pa rin. Parang tayo din, nag-outing ka, pero wala kang enough na perang gagamitin. Mahilig kayo mag-outing ng magbarkada, pero wala kang trabaho, panay ka umasa kay mama, hindi ka nakakatulong sa problema ng bahay o sa problema ng dapat unahing bilhin sa ating kanya-kanyang pamamahay. Nahihirapan si mama at papa maghanap ng pambayad ng matrikula natin, pero hindi ka nag-aaral lang maayos, panay ka lakwatsa, panay absent. Tapos ang pagbintangan natin, ang mga teachers na walang lumbay sa pagtuturo through online. Akala nyo madali ito? Kung nahihirapan kayo mag-attend sa online classes, parehas lang tayo. Parehas tayo na may kanya-kanyang responsibilidad na dapat din nating tugunan. Hindi lang tayo one-sided. Isama mo din paminsan-minsan sarili mo sa bawat pag-iisip na siyang ginagawa nating konklusyon para makapanghusga tayo sa ibang tao. Okay? Kung ano yung naitutulong natin at naimbag natin sa ekonomiya ng ating bansa, ganun din sa ating pamilya at sa ating sarili. Now, let's continue. To mitigate the risk of these loans, banks that were lending house owners money pulled these mortgage payments and sold them as mortgage-backed securities or MBS. One MBS would be a combination of multiple mortgages that they assumed would pay a steady rate. So, steady rate lang. Pasabot, ibig sabihin, yun talagang babayaran mo. Hindi tumataas, hindi mo mababa. Yun lang talaga. Kung kailangan mong bayad ng 1,300 a month, so yun lang talaga ang babayaran mo every month. Okay? Financial experts wrongly assume that even if many of the borrowers were individuals and families would struggle to pay, a majority would not default. Moreover, banks thought that since there were so many mortgages in just one MBS, a few failures would not ruin the entirety of the investments. So hindi ibig sabihin na ang isa hindi nakabayad, malugi ka. Hindi ganun. Sana makausap natin yung mga magagaling sa investment sila. Kagaya ni yung very popular masyado ngayon na maraming mga investors kagaya ni Manny Villar. Ang gagaling niya. Sa housing lamang, napakinabangan na ng buong Pilipinas, dami nang nanirahan, sa murang halaga, ay dami nang nakakuha ng murang pabahay. Ang tanong, naging masaya kaya sila? Naging fair din kaya? Naging steady din kaya ang rate? If ever, na hindi makabayad? Pasensya na po. Nagtatanong lang. Okay? Banks also assume that housing price would continue to increase. Oo, mahirap to pag sa bangko ka. Ito yung nasa isip ko. Pag nagdideposito ako sa bangko, yung pera ko, pinatulog ko siya na 1 taon. Pero yung interest, kunti lang. Pero nung sumali ako ng isang cooperative, naging stockholders ako sa isang cooperative, bakit ang laki ng binalik sa akin? Parehas lang yung perang ininvest ko noon. Way back early 2000. Hindi kaya nagdideposito tayo sa bangko at ginagamit yung pera natin, ipapahiram at saka yung tubo, sila ang nakikinabang? Napag-isipan ko lang yun. Napag-isip-isip ko lang. Pinatulog natin yung pera, tapos pag hindi ka gaano mayaman, hindi ka importansya sa mga tellers. I'm sorry sa mga tellers. Sa mga bank tellers. Kasi naranasan ko din yun eh. Pag hindi ka importante, pag hindi malaki yung savings mo, hindi ka i-greet na kagaya ng mga malaking investors. Hi ma'am, hi sir, good morning. Pagkapasok pa lang. Pero ikaw, ginigreet ka ba? Nako, pasensya na po. Nagkakaroon nga tayo ng mga biases nga din. Sa pag-uugali lang din yun. Now, let's continue. These banks could simply reacquire the homes and sell them at a higher price, turning a profit. See? Therefore, even if homeowners defaulted of their loans, still the banks could simply reacquire the homes and sell them at a higher price, turning a profit. So magpalugi bang bangko? Hindi. Pero ikaw, nalulugi ka na. Magsisave ka pa rin ba sa bangko? Ikaw lang bahala. Basta ako, ewan, kasi wala pa akong savings eh. Sometimes in 2017, however, some prices stopped in increasing as supply caught up with demand. Moreover, it slowly became apparent that families could not pay off their loans. This realization triggered the rapid reselling of MBS as banks and investors tried to get rid of their bad investments. This dangerous cycle reached a tipping point in September 2008 when major investment banks like Lehman Brothers collapsed, thereby depleting major investments. Kaya nga siguro, pag pakiramdam mo na ganito na yung bangko, tagilid na din yung investments mo, mag-isip-isip din tayo. Hindi lang yung pabigla-bigla. Dahan-dahan lang. Pag nakita mong lumalago, then continue. Pag nakita mong hindi, ingat-ingat lang sa pag-invest. Huwag dire-diretso. Magtira din para hindi tayo maubusan. Kagaya nga sinabi ng mama ko, ng late mother ko, sabi niya, ubos-ubos biyaya, bukas nakatunganga. Hanggang sunod nating talakayan. Magandang umaga, magandang araw sa inyo at sa ating tagapakinig at tagapanood. God bless everyone. Bye-bye for now.